Hello, everyone. Today we're going to give a quick case demonstration of how to extend an argument, and I will be the one in C. No inherency. New regulations like the CAP policy increase oversight and prevent human rights abuses. That's Catanau 18. The CAP policy provides a framework under which the U.S. government will review and evaluate arms transfer. We take into account human rights and proliferation. Requires every cell be assessed for the risk. The same cannot be said for other suppliers around the world. Next, onto solvency. 1, there are claims that the plan wouldn't affect many countries is false. Out of the 165 countries we sell to, 77 would qualify as the highest risk. That means that plan cuts our sales in half. Their own evidence says that 31 countries bring in $3.1 billion. The plan doubles that loss. And this is not even considering big sellers like China, India, Mexico, Saudi Arabia that we still sell to. For example, Saudi Arabia alone brings in $30 billion. 2, this proves that the CAP policy is better. It not only evaluates high risk, but it also takes into account how we can help our allies and partners.
Hey all, my name is Maddox, and I'm going to be the 1/2nd affirmative today. And we're just going to go on the case flow. On solvency, they say we reduce arms sales to 77 countries and have our profits from arms, but that doesn't affect the solvency of the plan's mechanism, as we argue that the arms are the cause of human rights abuses, and B, we would argue that the profitized framing of international relations is the root cause of these crises. And on inherency, they say CAT solves better, but CAT policy was made in April of 2018 and has had 2 years to take effect. Since then, U.S. arms have bombed hospitals, homes, funerals, and schools, plus seeing the expansion of a cholera outbreak and famine. So essentially, I went level by level. They made arguments on a couple of different flows, including solvency and inherency. And so I very distinctly said when I was answering which contention. So I started off with solvency, and I prefaced their argument. She made the argument in the 1 in C that we reduce arms to 77 countries at least of the 165 that we sell to, and then that would half our profits. But then I directly responded by saying that that wouldn't mean we can't solve for the affirmative, because all we're trying to do is reduce human rights abuses. So the amount of countries that we stop selling to doesn't matter, in effect of solvency. And B, we make the argument that trying to justify with money, how much we sell arms to or who we sell arms to, is the reason that we have these problems to begin with. And then I went on to the inherency flow, and I responded to CAT policy by saying that there have been 2 years of empirics, which mean that empirically proven, which means that in the past these things have happened. We've seen 2 years of a world with CAT policy, and it hasn't stopped U.S. arms being used for human rights abuses, which means we can't trust CAT policy because it's had 2 years to take effect.
On the DA, first, uniqueness. The manufacturing sector is on the brink of stable. Future job losses will collapse the industry. That's Reuters 4-5. Manufacturing sector lost 6,000 jobs in March. Today, manufactured goods count for 12% of the economy that marks 10 years of expansion. Overall, the March jobs report was upbeat. 2, link. The plan restricts arms sales, which are the cornerstone of the manufacturing sector. That's now 423. Direct commercial sales rose to $136 billion in 2018. Foreign military sales rose to $55.66 billion. Transfer systems support thousands of U.S. manufacturing jobs. From scientists, engineers to wielders and electricians, arms transfers exploit economies of scale. Third, internal link. Manufacturing sector is key to U.S. military readiness. That's Navarro 18. Economic security is national security. To increase defense sales strengthen our strategic partners and help stabilize regional alliances. The ability of a military to surge in response to an emergency depends on our nation's ability to produce needed parts and systems. Lastly, impact. U.S. military readiness is necessary to prevent great power war. That's Dodd 15. Our arms must be ready for instant action so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. Likelihood that the next great power war would involve multiple nuclear weapon states means that it could end civilization, a posture that leaves peer adversaries downing the West's capabilities and resolve thus in fighting miscalculation. I stand ready for cross-ex.
Okay, cool. So let's start on your Navarro 18 card. You make the argument that manufacturing is key to military readiness, but during the 90s, which was an entire decade of empirics where we didn't increase on military spending because of the end of the Cold War, there was not an increase in violent conflict. What's the warrant to military readiness being necessary to prevent these conflicts?
I feel first, that time period is different than what we're experiencing now. They just got out of the Cold War, so of course they wouldn't want to engage in anything that rigorous. And 2, I would say that given how dependent we are on military, our economy, it's important that we maintain our position as a global power, given how we're involved like Saudi Arabia, Yemen,
Okay.
and other like hotspots in the world.
Let's go back to that first subpoint. You make the argument that they wouldn't want that type of rigorous conflict, but that's assuming that the Soviets were the only country that would want to engage in conflict. Why don't the other like hundreds of countries that would have the capability of going to war thump like their DA?
I'm not really understanding your question. Can you rephrase it?
Yeah, essentially. So you say that the Soviets didn't go to war after the Cold War because it would be too rigorous to challenge U.S. military readiness. But there are a bunch of other countries that would have the capability of waging a war. Why didn't those countries go to war? And like, why didn't the lack of military spending incentivize them to go to war?
I feel like in that case, it was because of like the superpowers and how they decided to like maintain that, I guess, like dominance in that situation. But like I said before, it's a different time, and the way that currently we're focused on like our military and how we're investing so much into it means that it's different.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Awesome. So yeah, the order is just going to be manufacturing or the disadvantage. 1, we outweigh. Prefer human rights to economic security, Thrall and Romani 18. The unpleasant truth is that the underwhelming economic benefits cannot justify Washington's level of arms sales. Arms sales simply do not benefit the United States economy nearly as much as Trump likes to claim. A large percentage of American arms sales go to countries with horrible human rights records, where arms are at risk of finding their way into the wrong hands. 2, no link. The plan would have virtually no impact on U.S. jobs, Hartung in Arabia 19. There are serious questions as to whether arms sales-related jobs should be an adequate reason to arm repressive regimes. Trump's assertions on arms sales and exports don't stand up even to minimal scrutiny. Based on actual deliveries, U.S. arms sales more broadly also create far fewer U.S. jobs than is commonly assumed. That would put the share of arms export in the total U.S. employment at well under 0.2% of total U.S. employment. But that figure is likely an overstatement. Many of the jobs associated with U.S. arms sales are based overseas due to co-production and offsets agreements. And 3, no impact. Military readiness does not prevent conflict, Vetweiss 11. There is no evidence to support a direct relationship between the relative level of U.S. activity and international stability. The limited data we do suggest the opposite may be true. During the 90s, the United States cut back on its defense spending. One would not have expected an increase in global instability and violence. The world grew more peaceful while the United States cut its forces. No state seemed to believe that its security was endangered by a less capable United States military. No militaries were enhanced to address power vacuums. No security dilemmas drove insecurity or arms races, and no regional balancing occurred once the stabilizing pressure of the U.S. military was diminished. Open for cross.
So in your second piece of evidence, how you talk about jobs, manufacturing jobs, only producing 2/10 of the economy. Mm-hmm. The question is, my Navarro evidence in the 1NC talks about how we produce we generate $200 billion from arms sales. How can you say that it's only affecting like 2/10 of like the U.S. jobs if it's producing that much GDP?
GDP doesn't necessarily correlate with the amount of jobs that are affected. We have evidence that directly indicates that the likely number of jobs that are invested in the arms sale industry are between 20 to 40,000. But we also have arguments that say that's an overstatement because most U.S. arms jobs are dealt overseas with co-production and offset agreements.
But even if that was the case, the fact that we have like economies of scale, we have different jobs within the manufacturing sector, like economists, like scientists, welders, electricians, etc. How do you account for like a cut in that, especially if the plan cuts our arms sales in half?
So our Hartung in Arabia 19 evidence is really good on this. It says most of the jobs that are associated with U.S. arms sales are based overseas due to co-production and offset agreements. Foreign military sales and direct commercial sales will often send offsets or like the way they agree with the contracts to other countries, meaning that these jobs aren't actually on U.S. soil. Therefore, they would not impact like the economy.
But wouldn't that still affect the GDP if we cut our arms sales in half?
No, because you're like making the argument that it's going to affect like homeland and domestic ability, but those jobs aren't centered on soil anyway. And we've also read evidence that even if you're looking at it on a monetary scope, that the amount that we would lose because of the plan would be infinitesimal and not enough to trigger your limit chain.
Your evidence says otherwise, but okay.
We can
talk about how human rights is like we should prioritize human rights to like economic, but wouldn't you say that war like creates a lot of like human rights violations?
We would argue that your fear-mongering like rhetoric and the way you're framing the conflict is like one of the root cause to human rights abuses. And by solving for human rights, then we are solving like the root cause for why these wars happen in the first place.
Just pushing back. Well, for the 2NC, I think I would just focus on just pushing back on like the link and focusing more on making arguments against their third point in the 2AC.
Okay. And what were you trying to do in cross-examination?
I was basically trying to mitigate or like minimize his argument about like the impact and how it affects only like 2/10 of U.S. like American jobs. So
Okay. And Maddox, kind of what was your strategy in the 2AC, and then what were you trying to do in cross-examination?
So essentially, I wanted to challenge the disadvantage from multiple levels or angles. I made the argument that we should control the direction of the framing because we're saying human rights are better than economic security, because when you prefer like economic security and these justifications, you ignore countless human rights abuses. Secondly, we read a no link card, which is basically indicating that we wouldn't trigger their chain or link chain or narrative because there's like not enough impact on U.S. jobs for us to lead to a like increased chance of great power war, which means that even if the DA wins their impact because we don't cause it, that means that it's not a reason to vote nay. And lastly, we read a no impact card, which is like kind of just playing like terminal impacty, which means like we're saying this big and gaudy impact that they claim at the end of the 1NC isn't going to happen because we have empirics, which I mentioned in the first cross-ex, which is saying basically in the 90s, the United States cut back drastically on its arms sales spending, but it didn't correlate with an increase in violent conflict at all, which means that even if the United States military like readiness were to decline, we wouldn't trigger a great power war.
So while Joyce finishes prepping, you have a lot of arguments there, you have a lot of pieces of evidence, but you don't have a ton of time in the 1AR. So what's the thought process as to how you choose which arguments you like or don't like for the 1AR?
The 1AR is kind of like a speed race, and it's not where you win a debate, but you can definitely lose it there by investing too much time in the wrong places. So depending on the block, I'm going to really push back against arguments I think that I have the greatest chance of convincing the judge of in the 2AR. And I'm not going to spend a super large amount of time on each argument, as the 1AR is all about efficiency and getting the arguments you need out so you can move on to the rest of the debate so that your partner, the 2A, can then like extrapolate that argument from the 1AR and really expand and contextualize on that.
First, I'll be reading an overview and then going line by line. Vote negative because the disadvantage outweighs the affirmative. First, magnitude. Great power war. Cambodia, Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, and many other countries will be pulled in because of the U.S. inability to keep a strong military presence. There are several hotspots in the world that can easily bring in superpowers, ending in a nuclear catastrophe and devastating after effects. Next is time frame. Our database talks about miscalculation at any time. If there's any doubt cutting cells to like 50% of our customers, it will immediately gain attention, and that could trigger any type of war. And the response can happen within a few weeks. First, be answering the link argument. One, the only way to maintain human rights for not just like those at risk, but the globe is to maintain our arms sales. And we can prioritize both human rights and economic security. The cap policy restricts arms sales, but also gives a lot of support and tech to our allies and partners, which they have not answered. Two, the plan links. Arms sales are key to jobs and national security. That's Navarro 423. Lockheed Martin 516 production supports over 16,000 jobs over 41 states. It is significantly increasing both economic and national security. We empower our allies, grow a workforce, and keep Americans safe. 3, even if this piece of evidence cites 16,000 jobs, A, that's just one type of aircraft that we're making here in the US. B, Navarro evidence cites almost $200 billion in arms sales. A lot of people have to be working in order to make that much money. And before Navarro evidence, as a professor of economics at UC Irvine, versus their leak evidence about authors who don't have the same data on money or jobs and how that affects the economy. 4, even if the affirmative team claims it doesn't have a big impact or GDP on jobs, it's a huge perception argument that they're not answering. If the U.S. suddenly cuts arms sales to Saudi Arabia or to other countries that other countries have close eyes on, then that means that shifts like our balance or shifts our ability to keep our presence in those areas, causing war. Finally, impact. Yes, there is an impact. Technological changes require military readiness. That's O'Halloran 11. The following are scenarios that the U.S. military could be called upon to deal with the coming years: airstrikes against Iran, war between India and Pakistan, another Korean war. Any list will evolve not as a function of geopolitics, but also of technology. Implication of tech trends are the domains in which conflict could take place, and for which the military will be looking for to find solutions, and will extend to new areas such as cyberspace and global environments as well. Thank you.
So while Maddox preps, Joyce, kind of walk me through what we did in the 2NC.
So this is basically what I did in the 2NC was just to add a bunch of arguments on the link, figuring how like the 2AC and like the cross-ex turned out. It's better to protect myself in the block and just add a bunch of arguments, talking about providing different edges or different viewpoints. So even if, the affirmative team might have an argument about like, oh, it might not affect jobs, it's overseas, or it might not affect the GDP, we can still make a perception argument and we can still have that access to the impact. And then that just allowed us to further like talk about the impact and talk about how economic security protects and prioritizes human rights as well.
So what was the thing you started off with before you started answering arguments?
An overview. It's important to use an overview in order to like talk about your impacts and tell the judge really why it's important to prioritize your impact. And for me, whenever I do Mr. T, I try to pick maybe one or two strongest points. So here I chose magnitude and time frame. You could also talk about risk, but it's easier to just kind of simplify or to like size down and just focus on one or two and really give specific examples, like how I talked about different countries.
If you win this debate, what do you think you win the debate on?
I think I would win the debate on the link, specifically like the impact. Even if they have some kind of claim that human rights should be prioritized and that they affect a lot of lives, I think nuclear war or a nuclear winter outweighs.
Hey, Max, you about good?
Yeah. I'm going to start with a brief overview that's kind of going to be like the case. And it's just where I'm going to do a lot of the impact calc debate. And then I'm going to move on to the line by line. Okay. We good? All right.
Mm-hmm.
We massively outweigh on probability, which means you vote AF. The argument essentially is that we are much more likely, and there's 100% chance of our impact because human rights abuses are in the status quo right now, which means that we have 100% solvency on reducing those. They have this gaudy existentialist impact, but there's no real quantifiable bright line or impact scenario in which they access nuclear war. However, you can literally turn on your news and see the human rights abuses that are going on in Yemen, in Mexico, and Colombia by United States arms, which means we outweigh on probability, and probability is a better metric to evaluate impacts in magnitude or time frame because the most realistic problems are the ones you should solve for. If your friend fell down and broke their leg, you wouldn't not help them up because you're worried about like the Death Star blowing up the planet. You would solve the impact that's actually in front of you. Moving on to the line by line, we outweigh, extend Garland Dormini 18, economic justifications have been empirically used to brush aside atrocities that are produced by American arms sales. They have completely dropped this art, and you can look to the flow to that. That means we are controlling the direction of the framing debate, which means that you should prefer probability because if we're winning our framing and that economic justifications are a less superior way to like weigh your impacts, and that probability should come first, that means we have our 100% have leniency on the framing debate, which means you vote half on probability. And two, they have fundamentally mishandled the Hartung and Arabia evidence that indicates that all of the jobs in the Navarro study are actually offshored and wouldn't impact the United States economy, thusly not triggering the link chain. They can read 4 cards or make arguments all they want, but because they've conceded the key 2AC argument that the reason we're not accessing the link chain is because those jobs aren't actually in the United States economy, that wouldn't spark. And also they mishandled the warrant. Our argument isn't about 16,000 jobs in the no impact card. It's about the 90s disproving with empirics of years of no conflict because of US drawbacks.
Woo. So, mind walking us through what you did there?
Yeah. So first, I had a kind of lengthy overview where I'm talking about like the scenario in which we're claiming. We're claiming that there's like human rights abuses going on in Yemen, Mexico, Colombia, and that would be a lot more fleshed out if we had a case proper page. But because I'm kind of just trying to do that so we can have a clash on an impact debate, I was just explaining that probability, or the R in Mr. T, risk, is the way that we're winning this debate because there are human rights abuses in the status quo. It's not like saying like we might cause this impact or like a thing where it's like a cause and relation. We're making the argument that the impact is already in the status quo and can only get worse without the plan, which means that there's a high probability that we solve. And like I make the argument that we completely solve for that and like there's no pushback. And then I make the argument, which is really key and really like good for winning your impact calc debates. I told you why you should prefer probability over magnitude and time frame, because it's easy to just say I outweigh on probability, but saying why that controls the direction of framing and why you should prefer probability over magnitude is what sets you up for like late debate like wins. Then I went on to the line by line. I extended the Thrall and Germany 18 evidence that was in the 2AC right here that says human rights outweigh economic justifications. And I pointed out that that was fundamentally dropped, meaning there's no answer to that, which means that like in a policy debate mindset, you should consider this argument to be a true one, or you should have a much lower bar for like discounting, well, a higher bar for discounting this art. And I made the argument that because I won that human rights outweigh economic security, you're viewing it through our framing, which is like probability, which just helps out the affirmative. And then I said why human rights should be preferred over economic justifications, because just pointing out a drop isn't really doing anything. It's just pointing to the flow. But if you explain why that drop helps you in a certain area, like the direction of the impact debate, then that's where you like make strategic use of the drops. And then lastly, I extended the Hartung and Arabia evidence. And you can see here, they like really buried the no link debate. They make like 4 arguments on it. That's why I didn't spend so much time on it, because I know that they're just like out carding and out arguing me. So I don't answer all these 4 arguments. Instead, I extend the one part of the 2AC I think I'm ahead on. And that's where I'm saying that because the jobs are offshore, that's the key warrant for why it wouldn't trigger the link. So I can let her have these 4 arguments, but if I win that it wouldn't trigger the link because of my reason, then it still wouldn't matter. And then I did the same thing for the impact debate, where I talk about how the like empirics of the 90s like take out the risk of the DA.
So what do you think the weakest part of the 1AR is?
The weakest part of the 1AR, I think that I could have done more on the like not impact calc, but rather the impact D proper. Like on the line by line, you see I have all this explanation, but all they really got was no impact. And I kind of restated an argument from the 2AC and cross-ex, which said that like the 90s disprove. However, if I had used time more efficiently or decided to go for this argument more, I could have used more empirics and explained the full story of why that disproves it. And I could have maybe pulled evidence. Like I could have explained the warrant to Hartung and Arabia, but rather I kind of just said the argument over again as opposed to flushing it out fully.
All right, so last thing, it's really easy to see that on the board. If we could take a look at a sheet of paper flow, you can hand it to Joyce. You got a little bit?
Not really. Wasn't told to.
All right. Backtrack. So Joyce, one last thing for you. If you lose the debate as the negative, what do you think you lose the debate on after this 1AR?
Probably on the framing. I touched on it a little bit, talking about how like human rights is exasperated. Sorry.
Exacerbated.
Exactly. It's magnified through war and like through like these hotspots, and I think that like the impact. Although I spent a lot of time on like the overview and just talking about how jobs are important and etc. But I think working more on like the impact and like the framing of it would have really helped.
Okay. Well, unless there are any other questions, we're going to hop off. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.